We now present For the Record.
Welcome to For the Record. I'm Will Keneally. Now later in the show, we'll preview this coming week's budget address with a new report from Forward Analytics on the state's income tax collections. Plus, we'll hear from our final DPI candidate, incumbent Superintendent Jill Underly. But this week, we start out with the state Supreme Court, and the justices heard an argument in the case that will decide the fate of UW nurses to unionize. Now, that's a precursor case to a separate lawsuit challenging the whole of the Union Law Act 10. Joining us now is a member of SEIU Wisconsin with UW nurses, Colin Gillis. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So this is two separate cases kind of arriving at the same time in the same vein here. 2011, when Act 10 was actually signed into law, was more than a decade ago. How did we get to this week specifically?
It's a long story. Our newest campaign to win back collective bargaining rights really begins in 2019, but this particular case arises from the agreement that we made with our employer to avert a strike in 2022. We applied for recognition under the Wisconsin Employment Peace Act, and we're appealing the decision of the Wisconsin Employment Relations Commission not to recognize us under that law.
So when you talk about unions and kind of negotiating that contract with their workplace, you might talk about workplace conditions, raises, that kind of stuff. Why is it so important for this group of UW nurses to unionize?
I think every worker has a right to unionize, but for nurses, it's really about our patients and our communities. We get into this work because we want to care for people. And part of the way we care for people is advocating for our own working conditions. And collective bargaining through a union is one of the most important tools that nurses have. And
so we heard a little bit of the arguments during the oral arguments earlier this week. Kind of talking about the relationship that the nurses have with this entity that is kind of UW Health, whether it's a true kind of public entity or whether it kind of functions as a private corporation there. Can you describe a little bit of that, like what that relationship looks like with what would be the union and the UW hospital here?
So UW Health is an authority, which means it's sort of this public-private hybrid, but essentially, since the 90s, it's operated as a independent corporation. It was once subject to fiscal oversight from the legislature. It isn't anymore, but it still has elected officials on its board. And because of this hybrid nature, its status as an employer is somewhat unclear under the law. This case turns on whether the definition of employer in the Wisconsin Employment Peace Act covers UW Health. And as someone who works there, it sure feels like I have an employer and that they should fall under this, but I'm not a lawyer or a judge.
So we'll kind of wait to see how these justices decide this case, obviously within the next couple of weeks. We also will see them take up Act 10 as a whole, and striking down the major portion of that law as well. Regardless of kind of how the justices rule on this, do you have a sense of what this will look like for UW nurses going forward, kind of what the future of the organizing for a union's sake will look like?
There's definitely a fork in the road here. We want our collective bargaining rights, and a collectively bargained contract, I think, is the best tool that nurses have to advocate for the best working conditions and patient care conditions they can. Even if we don't get that, though, we will continue to advocate for our patients through the resources that we do have. And since 2022, we have had, thanks to the Memorandum of Understanding that we won through that strike threat, we've had regular meetings with our administration, and I think that those meetings have been both productive and collaborative. And I would hope that they would continue, regardless of if there's no collective bargaining under the law.
Wonderful. Well, Colin Gillis, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now, when we come back, we take a look at the state's income tax collections over the years with the director of Ford Analytics, Dale Knapp. He joins us right after this. Welcome back. We're just a few short days away from learning the governor's budget plan, as he will deliver his budget address on Tuesday. Now, among the debate in the Capitol is how to spend the state's funds will be over tax cuts. And this coincides with a new report from Ford Analytics about the state's income tax collection. Joining us now is the director of the group, Dale Knapp, and thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So this looks at tax collection over the years. Can you describe some of the trends that we've seen?
Yeah, so essentially we focused on the income tax cuts, the rate cuts in particular, from 2013 to the last ones in 2023. And I think people don't understand really the net effect of those, how big those cuts were. We're looking at, for moderate to lower income people, cuts of 24% and up compared to 2012. And even when you get into middle and higher income groups, we're still looking at double-digit cuts in terms of what they would owe. So the cuts, the cumulative effect of the cuts were very large. $7 billion over the 12, 13 years just from the rate cuts, about $8.5 billion total for all of the cuts that they did on the income tax.
The other thing we talk about too a lot in the Capitol is different targeted income tax cuts, with the governor, for example, saying that he wants it targeted to a specific middle-class group of Wisconsinites. When we see the collections coming in from the income taxes, it's not necessarily concentrated among certain tax brackets, right? It has an interesting distribution.
Yeah, and again, when you look at the cuts, the bulk of the cuts ended up going to, in terms of percentage terms, ended up going to those lower income, middle income, and even to upper middle income taxpayers. So, the only group that didn't benefit a lot from the cuts was the highest income group. Now they benefited from the cuts in all of the other brackets, but the top bracket was only cut a very small amount. So that the cuts have gone to middle and lower income taxpayers.
The other interesting component of this too is how Wisconsin ranks among other states and how that has changed over the years as well.
Yeah, and that was the other reason for the study. We wanted to look at how did those rankings change. Typically, historically, we look at the income tax. We've been considered a high income tax state. Oftentimes in the top 10 of states, if you look over the long period, roughly 8 to 15 in terms of highest income tax. The cuts over the past 10 to 13 years have dropped us from, depending on how you measure it, we were either 9th or 13th on two measures in 2012 to 26th and 29th in the bottom half of states in 2022, the last year that we can look at it. So we've gone from a high income tax state to the bottom half, which really changes the narrative about Wisconsin, I think, in terms of taxes. And I think that's a good thing for the state.
So as we were mentioning before, we were just a couple of days away from the governor delivering his budget address, finally getting that kind of draft language of what he wants to see the next 2 years. Republicans will certainly, make their changes to that budget draft. How do you think this might shape some of the budget discussions at a 30,000-foot view that we'll see over the next couple of months?
Well, I guess I'm not totally sure how it's going to shape it. I think if you look on the Republican side, I think what they've been talking about, they want to sort of continue with the tax cuts that have happened over the past, since 2013, and I think that help us again to move even further out of into the bottom half of states. I think Governor Evers, on the other hand, is probably a little bit more cautious, and he's looking at are those tax cuts going to mean that we can't invest in schools and in local government and in other programs. And so I think, and that's typically what it's been over the past several years anyway. So I don't think that'll change much.
Well, interesting. A lot to watch out for. Dale Knapp, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll be right back after this. Welcome back. Early voting in this spring primary is already underway, with Election Day coming up this Tuesday. Among the races on the ballot this February is the race for State Superintendent of Public Instruction. Now, Tuesday's election will narrow the field in that nonpartisan race from 3 candidates down to 2. In our final sit-down with the candidates running in that race, Ellie LaLiberte sits down with the incumbent Jill Underly. Here's more.
First things first, kind of give people who aren't so familiar with you a little bit of your background and who you are and why you're running for re-election.
Yeah, great. So thanks so much for the opportunity to meet with you today. I am Dr. Jill Underly. I am the Wisconsin State Superintendent of Public Instruction. I ran for this office back in 2021 and was elected to my first 4-year term. So I'm running for re-election because we've done incredible things. We've done some really great things. I came from a background as a teacher, a principal, a rural superintendent. I'm a mom of 2 kids. I live in Southwest Wisconsin. And under my watch, we have raised standards. We've actually gone from 13th in the nation, according to U.S. News & World's report, for education to 6th. So that was the most recent. We're excited about that. We've also raised graduation rates, which is incredible, considering coming out of COVID, a lot of states and communities were struggling with graduation. And so Wisconsin is among the highest in the nation now with graduation. And that's really a testament to the work that we've been doing. We've been investing in mental health, teacher recruitment and retention, and making sure that we're getting the resources to the schools so that they can do these incredible things. One of the other accomplishments that we've had under my watch is the bipartisan literacy bill, also known as Act 20, which has increased reading curriculum and comprehension to all our elementary school students.
And so another question for you, kind of bouncing off this topic, is, what would make this term different from your last? Is there things that you're like, this would be on the agenda, this is what I think worked well last time, that would work well or didn't work? Talk to me a little bit about that, what that would look like.
So we know what works, which is really wonderful, right? So that we can do the things that work, but we can't do those things without the funding. And so that's what's really important about this next term. For the past 15 plus years, Wisconsin public schools have just been chronically underfunded. You see it in the number of referendums, for example, that are on the ballot. Last year, in 2024, approximately 50% of Wisconsin school districts had to go to referendum. But what does that revenue do for schools? It helps pay teachers, it recruits and retains teachers, it pays them. It also invests in the classroom, in curriculum. It also helps with special education services and getting students the services they need so that they can be successful. And we can't do it without funding. And that's really the piece that has set us apart. If we want to go from good to great, we really need to fund our schools. And so that's what I'm going to be pushing for in this next budget.
And so I want to kind of now jump into what I think is probably the hot button issue for this campaign, which is the cut scores. Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about what your decision to lower those was back, I think it was in the summer. Talk to me about that decision.
Yeah, well, thanks first of all for getting it right, because there, what we did was we periodically, because of the Forward exam, which is our state assessment, teachers go in and they look at the standards that we're testing kids on, and then they take some out, they put some in, and this most recent iteration, we increased standards in math and science, and we also added standards for career and tech ed. So whenever you make changes to the test, you have to change the grading scale for that test. Every teacher knows this. Everybody who's evaluated at work knows that you have a rubric for which you are, graded against, right, for whatever performance. And what we had previously was a grading scale, or the cut scores, a grading scale that wasn't matching the test. It matched an entirely different test. And our teachers were like, can we put this to, can we basically ask our other teachers to look at this and come up with cut scores that will match the test. So we're actually testing kids and assessing them on Wisconsin standards. And so that's what happened, was that we revised the scale for which we were testing kids on. And as a result, to be proficient at certain standards, the bandwidths were changed. And so it was lowered from a different standard previously.
And so you've gotten some pushback on this. I mean, both of the other candidates running in this campaign are very against this. I mean, the governor has also spoken out. Do you stand by this decision? Is it something you would revisit? I
do stand by it. It's what's best for kids, and that's why I stand by it. And I think people are just really misunderstanding it. I think initially, you know, with the misunderstanding, people were saying that I lowered standards, and that was not the case at all. What we did is we changed the cut scores. And so the critics are absolutely getting it wrong. This was a recommendation that came from teachers because they wanted to make sure that they could take this test and identify the areas that kids needed assistance in. And my response to this would be, if we are increasing our standards, and we're actually 6th in the nation now for education, and we have the highest graduation rates, we're not doing that by lowering standards.
And I kind of want to ask your opinion about what some of the thoughts that the critics have said, which is that lowering these standards skews the data a little bit, so it makes us look like we're doing better than maybe to national standards we are. Can I get your response to that?
Yeah, so I think that, again, they're talking about two different things, because coming out of COVID, there was always going to be some sort of skewing of data. We were told coming out of COVID that, you know, just take all of this with a grain of salt because we're not testing as many kids. You know, there was definitely some issues with, you know, learning loss and kids coming in and out of the systems and everything like that. And so that was part of it. Like, we needed to measure on our assessment what kids were actually learning. We didn't need to use a grading scale on something else. And the grading scale that we were using was NAEP. We have a national comparison with NAEP. Every state takes NAEP. And then every state has their own assessment. And in Wisconsin, it's the Wisconsin Forward Exam. And it's not right, in my opinion, and I think in all the educators who came to me with this recommendation, that we were holding kids in Wisconsin on the Wisconsin test to a standard for a national test. I'm all in favor of high standards. I'm all in favor of challenging kids. But if we're going to spend the time that we are spending on assessing kids, let's make that assessment mean something, and let's be able to interpret the results fairly.
And so a big part that you're touching on here is funding, and of course, to get that funding, you have to work with the governor and the state legislature. Yeah. So governor, who has been critical of that cut scores decision, and the legislature, who's now proposing something to kind of go against that. How do you plan to work with those two entities?
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be something, right? There's always going to be disagreements, but there's always going to be agreements, and there's always going to be room for compromise. The governor has declared this the year of the kid, and I'm really excited about that, because when you think about the things that work in our schools, and this is something that I touched on earlier before, we know what works. And we just have to have the courage to invest in those things. We know that small class sizes work. We know that having high quality teachers work, and we have to pay them well. We know that investing in kids' mental health works. We know that having high standards and challenging kids works. We know that feeding kids works. So we know all these things. We want them to be safe, and we want them to belong in our schools, and we know that that works too. And so we really need to invest in these things, and then we will continue to see our successes rise in the state. Like I said, we have among the highest graduation rates in the country, and that's by no accident. It's because we've invested in things like mental health and making sure that we have kids who are interested in the curriculum, such as career and tech ed. We invest in those things. Kids show up to school, and then they also are learning, right? And they're going to graduate high school, and they're going to be their best selves.
Perfect. And just a couple more questions for you here today. Obviously, we're in Madison, second largest school district in the state. How do you plan to support larger school districts like the MMSD one?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question, and that's something that has also been a priority of ours in my administration. So we meet with the largest school districts monthly as a group, and so we talk about some of the issues that are most pressing to them. But the biggest way that we've been able to help is just to continue to advocate for that school funding. They need funding if they're going to continue the great work that they're doing. And the other side of this is we have to also advocate that we cannot be funding two school systems. As I said earlier, when we put money into the voucher system, that is taking money out of our public school systems. And so you do see these really large referendums like we saw in Madison as a result of that, because we're transferring millions and hundreds of millions of dollars out of public schools to fund vouchers. And if I'm going to support the largest school districts, if our communities are going to support their large school districts, we have to be against that.
When we come back, the latest we know on the governor's upcoming budget address. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back. We end this morning with breaking news out of the governor's office. He is proposing significant changes to the state's correction system, and he made the announcement during a news conference on Friday. Now, News 3 Now and some other news outlets were able to attend that news conference on the condition that we would hold the story until this morning.
Today I'm announcing a domino series of facility changes, improvements, and modernization efforts across Wisconsin's correctional institutions that will enable us to finally close one of our oldest institutions, and will save Wisconsin taxpayers about $1 billion right up front by not building a new facility that won't help us anytime soon, because it won't be done for another decade.
Now, the governor's plan would ultimately close a state prison in Green Bay and make a series of remodels to existing prisons. That includes moving juvenile inmates from the embattled Lincoln Hills facility and transfer them to a series of smaller sites around the state. Now, that would include a facility in Oregon right here in Dane County. This is a tease to what we can expect this coming week in the governor's budget address, where we'll learn more about the governor's two-year spending plan. That does it for us this week. I'm Will Keneally. Have a great rest of your weekend.
This has been For the Record.